Everyone, my name is David Fitzgerald. I co-host this center's activities today with our friends from the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA on Kyoung Park's new book, LA Rising, Korean Relations with Blacks and Latinos After Civil Unrest. This is part of our ongoing book series. Next week, we'll be talking about Professor Elizabeth Cohen's new book, Illegal, How America's Lawless Immigration Regime Threatens Us All. You can find information about all of our activities on the websites of both the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA and the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego. But today we'll be talking about Professor Park's book. She will present for about 25 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion by Professor Rocio Rosales, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at UC Irvine and a former fellow at CCIS. So welcome back, Rocio. Then we will kick it back to Professor Park for a quick response and then open up a general discussion. The way we'll run the general discussion is that if you have a question or a comment, please put that into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Or if you would like to ask your question live, please raise your hand to be unmuted for a live question and response. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Park.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm really thankful to CSIM and CCIS at UCLA and also UC San Diego, and particularly Professor Roger Waldinger and Sophia Tam, and also here Professor Fitzgerald. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. This is not, I'm getting the wrong slide, I'm sorry. Okay, so I start with my thesis. The 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest, and I would like to remind you it happened actually exactly around this time, 30 years ago, and I'm fortunate to be able to commemorate it with my book talk. So 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest involved Black Korean tension and Latino Korean relations, and I conceptualize as racialized class and cultural conflicts. So my various chapters analyze, for instance, the question about race and racism, you know, class and class conflict, and yeah, several chapters, and also on culture and cultural clash. All right, so my thesis is that different racial minorities such as African Americans, Korean Americans, and Latinos are positioned in a different way to really the US racial hegemony, capitalism, and national identity, national integration or symbolic integration. So I mean, because I, you know, see here that minorities are really, you know, they have a different access. I mean, in a way that they are positioned in a different way to various elements of inequality, and I am operationalizing here US racial hegemony, capitalism, or you can say racial capitalism, and national integration or symbolic integration, or politics of citizenship. And furthermore, these, you know, different access to US racial hegemony, capitalism, and national identity is impacting on the relationship among minorities and impacting in a different way. Therefore, it creates social political barriers and obstruct meaningful social relationship among African Americans, Latinos, and Korean Americans. So analytically, I see here that different axes of inequality, those are race and racial conflict, class and class conflict, and cultural clash, and politics of citizenship. In the end, it made an indelible impact on racial minorities, and furthermore, their relationship with one another. So in the end, actually, it constituted and contributed to a multi-tiered racial cartography. That's what I call, and that affected how Angelenos, whether they are Latinos, African Americans, or Korean Americans, think about, you know, others, other minorities, and themselves, and also interacted with each other. Right, so I use neo-Marxist Gramscian analysis with the emphasis on racialized capitalism, and also critical race class theory, because I'm looking at here how racism is constructed at the public sphere and political sphere, which appear to be, you know, fair and just, and yeah, but in fact it is racially organized, I would say that, and minorities participate, you know, to the limited extent. So I pay attention to the role of really racial formation, but state and non-state, and particularly through culture and economics. So Omi and Winant already talked about, you know, racial formations through state and political sector, but I am paying attention to market sector and also, you know, public spheres such as media. So I'm looking at here media and police and criminal justice system and government and educational settings, or we can add like financial, you know, institutions, how it really played a role. Right, so I will call my theoretical framework as unitary conceptual framework on inequality. So it's kind of intersectionality framework, but I am taking it to, relating it to race and class and citizenship and culture. So really, you know, intersectional way, and demonstrating that the single axis framework, you know, only using analytically the dimension of race isn't sufficient here, doesn't explain really, yeah. So, or even gender, right, among anti-racist and feminist scholars. So I view here how different groups are racialized in different way, in related yet distinct ways. So I analyze the importance of social class, citizenship, and culture in structuring interactions. Right, so I think just because it happened 30 years ago, so I would like to remind you of the most controversial ethnic tension, Black Korean tension, and that was about really, you know, African-American teenager was killed by a Korean grocer over shoplifting dispute, and you know, Judge Kalin didn't deliver any sentence term, just on probation, and which very much angered African-American community. Looking at it is the same thing, like, you know, police officers who beat Rodney King in a way that he couldn't stand up. They think that is the Korean grocer received the same sentence, racialized, and not a, you know, Black sentence nor a white sentence, is kind of multicultural Asian Americanist sentence. All right, so here is a flyer that, yeah, they call this woman owns a Buddha market and then boycott. All right, so I see here that Black Korean tension can be explained by just, something to do with African Americans, something to do with Korean Americans, because it involved white power, I would say that. So the instigating role of whiteness, in other words, that when the Judge Collin delivered the kind of racialized sentence, so I think I'm looking at here as a triad, okay? And yeah. Just to remind you that, as I mentioned, white police officers, they are acquitted, non-guilty verdict, and that led to 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest. And just to refresh our memory, it led to this kind of over 700 million in damages, and actually half the financial damage has been done to the Korean American community. And rioters, or those people who are arrested, half of them were Latinos, and 1 in 3 were African Americans. So yeah, more than 2,300 Korean-owned businesses, they were, affected, damaged, or destroyed, or looted. Okay. And at that time, in 1992, the percentage of Korean American population in LA was just a little over 1%. All right, so it has started with a well-organized rally in front of LAPD Parker Center, really protesting, this police violence, and that's the entrance to Koreatown, because riot started in South LA, and majority merchant at that time were Korean immigrants. And then also when rioters moved up north, then it was Koreatown. And this is how one of my informants, his liquor store in South LA was destroyed overnight. And you can see here graffiti on the wall that in explaining really 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest and Rodney King, beating, police violence was immediate cause, although that's not how media really reported. But also Sun Ja-do, Korean grocer, and Natasha Hollins, that incident also factored into. So Korean Americans organized the largest rally because Koreatown was not protected, and as you know, LAPD decided not to, because they didn't have enough resources, and also there is no point to endanger themselves. And basically, Koreatown didn't exist, I would say that, as worthy to protect. I mean, we can see if Korean immigrant merchant or white merchant, white American merchant, maybe things have been different. So, okay, analytically, I look at here, Black Korean tension, how to explain it. And I analyze it really how, tension has developed. So social construction of tension development, and also I don't think we can explain it by identifying just a single cause, So I try to look at the mechanism, how it has developed and over time. So race and racism played a negative role, So when I talk about race, I'm relating it to white racism at the criminal justice system, police, and media, and educational settings, and financial institutions. But also I do talk about subaltern racism. So Korean immigrant merchant, they are almost like a biological racism towards African Americans, and also African Americans, because merchants were not treated well. They were even physically assaulted or ridiculed, disrespected. So I think also Korean immigrant merchant complained about this lack of respect, and African American customers, they had also Orientalist and nativist racism. Although, you know, subaltern racism is different from like white racism or structural racism because it didn't have any white privilege, but still it led to a question of interracial justice, you know, and still it was dangerous, I would say that. All right, and citizenship also played a negative role, you know. And also culture. I mean, some Korean immigrant merchant, the way they conducted business, their business practice was seen as very parochial and sometimes seen as racist, you know, like they don't make eye contact, they wouldn't give a change directly to the hands of their customers, they don't smile, those things. Yeah, and also class, you know, between Korean immigrant, petit bourgeois small business owners and African American working class, and also under poor or urban poor, you know. Although we are talking about really just the relationship between merchant and customers, but yeah, it was in a way quasi-class tension. How to say that? All right, so it led to 4 degrees of separation. But when I look at Korean Latino relations, dynamics are very different. Eventually, it led to 2 degrees of separation and 2 degrees of convergence. So I, you know, identified the status as of Korean Latino relation as respectful quotient. So for instance, race and racism didn't play negative role, and also citizenship didn't play negative role, but culture and class, particularly class, because majority workforce at Korean immigrant-owned business establishment, you know, they were Latino workers, so often it was a matter of really labor relations, and sometimes it could develop into ethnic tension. Yeah. All right, so I move on to analytical interventions. So I argue here that US society has moved from white over black, the kind of bipolar, you know, racial framework, to multipolar racial framework or racial formation. It's not multicultural. You know, just adding Asian Americans or Latinos, it doesn't explain. And I'm not saying we are able to put an end to anti-Black racism, but I think we can explain it as a matter of just white-Black bipolar racial formation, because white supremacy really operates in a different way. And then also often at major racial incident, you know, either Latinos or Asian Americans have played a very important role. So I think epistemologically, we have to give independent entity to Latinos and Asian Americans. So I would say that complex negotiation of multipolar relationships as an unfolding multi-tiered racial cartography. So it's like a racial matrix, you know, and it's inflected on multiple axes, not single X, by class, citizenship, and culture. So I will also show you. All right, so racial cartography, I was inspired by Claire Kim's you know, notion of field of racial positions, but I differ from her because I'm also using other, you know, concepts, for instance, cognitive mapping, that how people, in this case, racial minorities, they map out their distance, their relationship, you know, with each other, and then also with even majorities, and then also how they map out their, you know, class and also cultural and racial distances or relationship. So I would say that these are the underlying, really, you know, Black Korean tension. All right. So I, view here that there is a unequal and differential power relations, not just between white and black, but also among different minorities and pertaining to race, class, and citizenship. So the really question is, how do people in South LA view others and themselves, even though they were physically close to each other, but historically that has not been the case. As you know, they were often segregated to different social settings. So with the not just the racial hierarchy, so the question of racial status and entitlement, but also racial distance. How do they measure their really relationship and social distance, and in some cases leading to racial tension. So still in this racial cartography, white Americans at the top and African Americans and Native Americans are at the right and bottom, because I think Asian Americans and Latinos are seen not fully granted really national belonging or symbolic integrations, okay, despite the century of presence, contribution, and struggles in the US. I mean, what African Americans are saying here is that African Americans struggled a lot, but they were not recognized. They contributed a lot to build this society. Still, they were not recognized, and they had to protest, and yet still they are not recognized. So it's just, if you make more money, it doesn't mean it's translating into higher racial status. All right, so I map out here racial positions, and the vertical one is a socioeconomic indicator. So it's a proxy for class, and horizontal one is rights of prior occupancy. So from African Americans' perspective, Latinos and Korean immigrants are, newcomer, okay? So they have yet to, really contribute to the society and also struggle, so these residency in the US or in South LA is a proxy for citizenship. So particularly cultural citizenship, I would say that. And I think we'll have to admit here that minorities have been stratified. There have been significant gaps in socioeconomic status between these groups. All right, and the model is flexible because in the future, if Korean Americans and Asian Americans, they really, contribute and, more integrated to the society, or their integration is recognized, then they can move to the right. Okay, I better show you my diagrams and figures. So I think racial distancing is really how each minorities, feel about other minorities, their distance, okay? So I agree with the Rebus that we can talk about it, whether race relation is good or bad, that's too simplistic, because using Rebus' prismatic engagement, saying that the sense of group position is shaped through the distorting optic of the prism of white dominance. Therefore, if there are same white and African American manager, people think that it's all right, to be disciplined by the white manager, but they don't think it's, there is a legitimacy in being subjected to discipline by African American manager. And also Michelle Ramont, symbolic boundaries, as I already mentioned, in measuring distance. All right, I already mentioned that African Americans, they do say they shed their, blood, sweat and tear, and yet they are not fully recognized. So really, Latinos and Korean Americans have a long way to go, So, and also Latinos and Korean Americans agree that African Americans have been politically, socially, and culturally an insider. All right, so this is a national racial cartography, and Vertically is a really socioeconomic indicator, or what I call household income above taxable minimum. And horizontal axis is centuries present within U.S. Foundation of U.S. nation state, independence since 1776. So definitely we will have to locate indigenous people to the right. And then, African Americans, like 1619 Project, some of them, they were here, they were brought here. And then, Latinos after US-Mexico war, so Latinos are kind of in between. But I think the socioeconomic indicator is actually Asian Americans socioeconomic indicator is higher, but poverty rate is higher too. So I lowered, so it looks like this way. And when you look at LA racial cartography, then because LA was founded by, a group of people, multiracial from Mexico, including Africans. So I think Latinos needs to be situated to the right, and yeah, so I think that is the major difference. And in South LA, Latinos' position has been lowered because in South LA, their socioeconomic indicator has been is lower than African Americans. So in a way, those Latinos have been blackened. Yeah. So multipolar racial formations, that means Asian Americans and Latinos subject to differential racialization from African Americans and also from each other, from the state and civil society. I already mentioned the subaltern racism, they act white or black, yeah. So I think these racial minorities have been victims of white supremacy, but also complicit in it as well, and influenced by class inequality and immigrant citizenship status. And after the unrest, it led to pan-ethnic racialization when we see coalition building between established Mexican-American Chicano leadership and Central Americans, or racial interpellation. I mean, Korean Americans did stand in for Asian Americans, and cross-racial class formation among Korean Americans and Latinos over immigrant rights issues and over labor issues, Latino hotel workers, supermarket workers, and garment factory workers, and what else? Yeah. So, and immigrant rights, yeah, issues. So, yeah, Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance, they advocated, they organized, Latino and also Korean workers. Immigrant rights issues, again, organized by Kiwa. And unfortunately, after the unrest, there is a continuing Black Korean tension because there is an anti-liquor store movement, and liquor store owners are mostly Koreans. So, but anyway, so yeah. But finally, like, almost 20 years later, there was an effort to reconcile. So both African-American community and Natasha Hallin's family members and Korean American community leaders and activists, they met. So yeah, so I think that's, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Park. Professor Rosales.
So thank you so much for that presentation. Dr. Park, I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. I was impressed with the depth and breadth of the field work, the observations, the interviews, and the archival analysis. The timing of all that work is also extraordinary, with fieldwork starting in January of 1992, several months before the 1992 uprising in April of that year, and then culminating in 1997 with another revisit in 2002. The 142 life histories and ethnographic interviews that you and your research team collected represent an impressive body of work. And the stories captured in these pages help explain and preserve an important moment in South LA history. I appreciate your conceptual contribution of racial cartography and believe it offers great insight into intergroup tensions and relations in an American context full of changing demographic characteristics. Your book made me think of a memorable passage in the 1968 Kerner Commission report, which you referenced briefly in the introduction. And this report investigated the 1967 acts of civil disobedience in various major American cities. The particular passage from the Kerner report that I'm talking about that has struck with me all these years later after reading it states, and I quote, "Segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it." Dr. Park, I believe your work in analyzing interethnic relations between African Americans, Latinos, and Koreans in 1990s South Los Angeles does a wonderful job of accounting for the role of white supremacy or white racism in structuring inequality among these groups. As you explain in chapter 2, white-dominated spheres of media, criminal justice, policymaking, and leadership helped structure the interethnic tension in South LA and our perception of it. Your model of racial cartography further expands our understanding of intergroup relations by focusing on the role of race, citizenship, class, and culture as important axes of inequality. I do have a few questions that arose as I moved through your text. This racial cartography model works well in explaining relationships in South LA before and after the 1992 uprising. But I wonder if this model also works well in this study because of the sheer volume of academic studies, media attention, and political analysis following that uprising. How might we usefully extend this model to other less studied and lesser known cases of intergroup tension? And to get a little bit more in the weeds, I want to focus on a critique you had of Black businessman and activist Danny Bakewell, who organized boycotts against Korean-owned businesses following the Du Harling's tragedy, which you explained in your presentation was the incident that involved a Korean shopkeeper shooting and killing a Black teenager following a dispute about a presumed theft. This happened in 1991. In the book, you write that Bakewell's concern did not move beyond a somewhat narrow and simplistic emphasis on Black capitalism. Neither did he challenge white supremacy as an oppressive system or analyze its economic or psychological impact. Bakewell's protests and reasoning seem to be supported by various entities in the community, including, as you note, Black churches, Black activists, and the Black Women's Forum led by Representative Maxine Waters. It seems that the critique of Bakewell's failure to understand the complexity provided by something like your racial cartography model, which makes me wonder if the model takes a top-down approach while some of your interlocutors provide bottom-up understandings of events. How do you reconcile this mismatch in understanding? Is it that some LA Black and Latino residents or Korean merchants only engage with some axes of inequality in their personal cognitive mapping? Meanwhile, you have other respondents who seem to have the capacity to understand the range of forces acting upon. For example, recognizing that the boycotts were rooted in anger towards not Korean merchants, but rather towards American society and government as a whole. I wonder if there were any particular characteristics among those who had this broad understanding of structure. Were these respondents who had that understanding longer term residents in the community or younger or more socially engaged? In other words, what were the specific characteristics among respondents that allowed them to have this wide angle view of social forces in their lives? I was particularly moved by your discussion of business practices in chapter 3 surrounding the handling of change and the materialization of racial difference. For those who haven't had a chance to read this great book, in this chapter, Dr. Park writes about Korean business establishments often giving customers change on small plastic trays, which prompted Black customers to wonder why the lack of physical contact existed and whether Korean merchants wanted to avoid touching Black hands. Meanwhile, Korean merchants believed customers did not want them touching their hands due to their aversion of merchants' own yellow hands. The explanatory power of ethnographic research truly shines, and your prose sings in these snapshots of interaction. Finally, if time allows, I really would appreciate hearing more of your development of intercessory ethnography and in what spaces and places it can best be deployed. As a fellow ethnographer, I'm always interested in methods, and I really was intrigued by this. How did your development and use of this intercessory ethnography influence your development of the racial cartography model? I hope that gives us enough for discussion, plus any questions that people might have.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Park, would you like to take a few minutes to respond before we open it up?
Yes, only partially, because I think, thank you, Dr. Rosales. I think really your comments are well taken. I really appreciate it. Okay, I think first the question that how this model racial cartography can be applied to other maybe interethnic or ethnic relations, right? Or tensions, those things. I would say that, I think right away, I could think about the relationship between like Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, I would say that, like in Chicago, because, for Puerto Ricans, citizenship is not a problem, right? But Mexicans, it's a legal status is important. So you see, even in relation to citizenship, these two groups, they relate in a different way, right? So I think I will say that probably if we apply to international settings or globally, I think I will have to maybe modify it, but I think this is a really limited nation state like the US, but I think it can be actually applied well, I would say that, so they are, we would have to understand that not just, how their cultures are different, but what has been the history, what has been their strategy, they use, and also how is it interpreted by other groups, you see? So it's really causing, those tensions. So I think I haven't really applied to other settings, it's just difficult for me to come up with like two-dimensional, this kind of, but I think actually before this model, I was just thinking about, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, because when I saw the movie, I'm forgetting the title of the movie, Mambo something, it was about Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, and it was very clear to me, how they are really coming with different background, different history, and therefore they developed a different strategy, and yet they are related to US, racial capitalism in a different way, you see, and yet it is causing misunderstandings and tensions, Puerto Ricans, they hardly understand why Mexican Americans are so much, concerned about legal status, but then Mexican Americans say, you guys never understand, So I would say that, I think I would have to think about it further, and I think that's a very good encouragement, but I am very sure that if we try to apply to international settings, I think it's different, because I think it's more, it needs a great revision, I would say that, but within the, US nation state, and also racial hegemony and market sectors, and then also symbolic integration, so we are not talking about whether you have a legal paper, it's more or less, how you could claim on and how you are treated, with respect as a member of this society. So I think I feel very much encouraged, but that's really all I can say. And unfortunately, even when I look at even Asian American studies, hardly there are any works to analyze interethnic relationship, because we all know that it's a challenge. It's not easy, but I think it's just we don't have it, So I think that's just I am kind of starting it. I would say that. All right, and about Brotherhood Crusade and Bakewell and Black nationalist, Black capitalist nationalist. I think I am trying to be kind of cautious here, because in the book I just try to capture these African American community organizing, right? But it wasn't my really objective to really critically examine, you see. I just tried to see how it related to Black orientation, okay? But I think this was really a problem, because when we had the Black orientation and when Bakewell organized the protest and then saying that, okay, we're gonna boycott any Korean-owned businesses, we can allow, but then, really media, mainstream media, and also, even right now he owns, LA Sentinel, ethnic media, very powerful and also close friend to Mayor Bradley. So mainstream media like LA Times always, featured him and treated him as the best leader, community leader, And also what I'm saying here is that when he was just saying we can't allow any Korean immigrants to own businesses, but then nobody within the African American community could contest or question, how you can, disallow, you see. But what I found out was later, 20 years later, when I was on the board to produce a documentary about Mayor Bradley, I had a chance to also meet with other African-American, advisors, right? And I realized that it wasn't, Bakewell was perceived in a different way, you see. It's just a one-off, you see. But within the Korean American community, he was seen the only important African American community leader, So Korean American community didn't think about what other ways they could communicate, And then because mainstream media always, really treated him as the only best community leader, you see. So I would say that really complexity, I think I'll have to go back, but it wasn't really my goal to critically examine, kind of different voices within the African American community. But I think in my book, what is described about these Black nationalists, like Bakewells and also other groups, you are right, as I mentioned, religious groups and also women's, groups, but their, their strategy and goal was very different from another African American community organizing, like in chapter 8, anti-liquor store movement that was mostly organized by African American women, including Congresswoman Karen Bass. So I just find it like so fascinating there. And then some people are in between or supporting both, parties. So I think, again, I think that, it's very encouraging to hear that. I think from you, and I'll have to look into, what kind of different voices were mediated or not mediated at that time. But I think it was at the time, it was Korean American community failed to contest that Judge Collins' verdict. They actually had a letter writing campaign and asking Judge Collins to, lend a more lenient sentence. You see, and that very much angered the African American community. But at the same time, like African American community also, they failed to express their view different from like Bakewell's, I would say that, yeah. All right, maybe I'm taking too much time here. Yeah, I think you asked a very important question. I would say that this racial cartography, and as you know, I was inspired by political scientist, right? Maybe your colleague, right? Claire Kim. But Claire Kim, as a political scientist, for her, racial triangulation is based on what the elite are talking about, or media, elite discourse, you see. But in my case, it was more ethnographically in everyday life, But I would say that when we look at, so I see more Los Angeles civil unrest is contesting the kind of shifting racial cartography, I would say that, So if racial cartography was in a way like racial triangulation, it was like heading and shaped by elite, but then during the unrest, they are challenging, you see. I would say that even when we talk about not just top down and grounds up, even grounds up, I think it's many different voices, I would say that, I can talk about even in relation to right now, this spike in anti-Asian hate crimes, those things. I think if you talk to people in the community, they have all very different views, you see. And I feel sometimes there is urgent need for people who are leaders and activists to really, how to lead, the common people, because otherwise it seems to be dangerous, I would say that. But anyway, I will maybe just mention your last and try to answer your last question about intercessory ethnography. And I'm surprised because that was one of the popular questions that I got from, of course, anthropologists, but also now by sociologists. Because, I am not just a professor at UCLA. And when I went to South LA, even Korean immigrants already heard me from radio at the time, So I think I wear many different hats, like community leaders and activists. And I couldn't waste a moment when I had a chance to talk to these people. Right away, I had to intervene, and I had to challenge them like my student, So yeah, because, it's a precious moment and I can't just collect data, you see. If, ethnography is like some white American from Global North, they can record and then they say, this is how Korean immigrants are saying this kind of very stupid things, very prejudiced. But I just couldn't just collect data and then take off, you see. So I had to use right away, I had to challenge, my informant, So I think that's how I did. And otherwise I feel that's like very condescending and paternalistic, that kind of study. I would say that I know that it's not easy, it can be done just right away, I would say that. But I think even after publishing this book, I do have a challenge, you see, because I think, some people in the community, they don't like that idea. They thought that when they cooperated with me, they expected that kind of, I'm gonna promote, you know, what they are saying. They didn't realize that, I have an expectation to critically examine, not necessarily, like they think that I'm airing the dirty laundry, right, in public. So I do have a continuing this kind of challenge, when they cooperate with me. They couldn't believe that when they see published the book, how they expected that I could talk about only positive things about Korean immigrants, but when it wasn't, they are very kind of devastated. So I have a continuing challenge. I was like, okay, I think I took too long. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have several questions. The first is a two-part question. So the first part from Lori Hart is, I would be interested in knowing how broadening the frame of reference beyond the US and integrating a sense of the global racial cartography intersecting with historical events like 9/11 and COVID-19 also shifts or redefines the racial cartography. That is not using this model that you developed in LA elsewhere, but the impact of the elsewhere on the national model.
Well, I think Lori is asking a really tough question. I think in a way that's what the Dr. Rosales also asked. I would say that, because I look at here in my mother, and I make it very clear, this is really limited to US nation state, but if we view here different racial minorities, their access to US racial hegemony, and we can say racial capitalism, then I'm viewing US as an empire, and empire operates also globally. So I think that is why I think right now there is an attempt to talk about it together. I would say that even abolitionists in the US, also globally, I would say that. So maybe I sound very abstract, but I think there is a way. I think Lori, probably we can develop it even globally, and the model is not going to be the same, but I think we will have to relate to geopolitics, and I would say that, and if we understand that, like anti-Black racism, perpetuated by and under the U.S. empire, then if we understand the U.S. empire also operates globally, then I think there is a connection, I would say that. But I think other than that, I think that's a little bit beyond the scope of my research. But I think I see very clearly even now, the way we talk about China. I think, these geopolitical questions is directly impacting on race relations. I mean, because unfortunately, I would say that even someday, pandemic, our COVID-19 coronavirus will be over. I think unfortunately we're gonna still have anti-Asian violence and hate crime. Why? And the reason is because this anti-Asian aggression happened even before the pandemic, although we had a spike, and the reason is these geopolitical things. As long as politicians, not just President Trump, but politicians and even in the media, every day they talk about China, bash China and something wrong with China, China as our enemy and threat. And I'm not supporting Chinese Communist Party, but what I'm saying here is that, this geopolitical interest, in what the US empire has domestically and globally, I think it's impacting on race relations. And I would say that right now, even one doesn't have to be white supremacist, but even racial minorities, they just think it might be because we are all indoctrinated, brainwashed, whatever Chinese, Asian Americans brought this coronavirus. And we think that it's a patriotic thing to attack that germ, people who are carrying that kind of germ. And so I would say that I think Lori is pushing further, but I think I believe already, not the scholars, but activists are already connecting you know, domestic and global matters. And also I think, you know, yeah, so I think that's all I can say. I would say that other than that, I think probably I need more work. I would say that, yeah.
Okay, here's a question from Helmer Mara, who writes, Professor Park, do you believe, according to your studies, that Black people consider themselves above other racialized citizens in the US due to their fight for recognition along with US history? If so, what other reasons could keep such motivation in South LA?
Well, David, can you repeat? I didn't take a look at the questions. Yeah.
Sure, it says, do you believe, based on your study, that Black people consider themselves above other racialized citizens in the US due to their fight for recognition in US history? If so, what other reasons could keep such motivation in South LA?
I think I don't necessarily agree with the first the contention that African Americans see themselves above other minorities. Although I mean, in my book, I quote, that's one of my interviewees was saying, because they see themselves as, you know, authentic Americans, but see like Koreans and Latinos as not yet really a US citizen, you know. So I think, you know, that's kind of a simple way to view it, I would say that. And I think really, is, as I mentioned, that's only one dimension, but I think African Americans that I studied in South LA, why they boycotted Korean-owned stores. One of the reasons is because they don't understand why they lacked business ownership, you know? So in their own neighborhood, you know, I mean, in the 60s, it was a Jewish, you know, and other white American merchant, and then now Koreans. And so I think, you know, in some senses, you know, African Americans, yes, in relation to citizenship question and symbolic integration, they see themselves as an insider than Asian Americans or Latinos, but I can say they do it same way in other dimensions or other arenas. You know, definitely they don't understand why they lack business ownership. Although I don't think, you know, small business ownership was the thing that African Americans pushed for, you know, after civil rights movement, they pushed for more participation and integration in the political sector, but not necessarily. And, you know, as you know, small business ownership has been a strategy for immigrants, I would say that, yeah. So I think I would say that again, I think it's kind of dangerous to, you know, to just to say, okay, you know, whether Black Korean, Latino Korean relation is good or bad, and then they see themselves as higher than other groups. But I think there is a complexity, and I would say that we'll have to look into, so we can find, you know, point of convergence or connections and point of also divergence, I would say that, yeah. So I think, you know, even though African Americans in South LA, they lamented this kind of lack of business ownership, but then the reason is it's not perpetuated by Korean Americans. Korean Americans didn't block, you know, African Americans' business ownership. It was perpetuated by our bank and financial institutions, because African Americans just still, when they apply for commercial loan, then they are likely to be refused, you know. So I think that's what I'm saying. It's like, it's not, you know, it's again in relation to maybe white supremacy or white racism. I think it's a bit complex, I would say that. But yeah, I'm forgetting maybe second point, but we can move on to maybe next.
Sure, so here's a question from Anisha Patil, building on something that you said at the end of your response to Rocio. How did conducting this sort of ethnographic research affect your relationships personally, and have you been able to maintain relationships with the people you connected with in your research?
Yeah, I would say that when because I was interested in really the people in South LA, whether they are Korean Americans and particularly African Americans, and then later Latinos. What was their, discourse, okay, how they analyze, how they interpreted it, okay? So I had to use really ethnography, because statistics, those things are rather misleading and not that helpful. Yeah, and then I think, Lucio read my book, but it wasn't easy really to conduct research in South LA because of Black Korean tension already, and I had to really come up with a team of multiracial research assistants because my African American interviewees, they didn't feel comfortable really talking to, they said that they want to be studied by the people that they can trust. And I thought that, yeah, the role of race and ethnicity of the researcher, makes difference. So I tried to come up with a Latino, African American, research assistant. So I will say that I conducted the research for a long time, and I think again, Rocio read my book. In my chapter 5, the Korean merchant, the liquor store owner that I observed for a year, and he was murdered, actually. I observed in year 2002 and year 2006, the merchant were killed, and he actually got along well with his customers, and he didn't have even language barrier or cultural barrier, So I would say that it's a difficult question. I mean, I am just doing my best to reciprocate, what the people that I studied, they did it to me. And I think that forever I am indebted. But of course I can do everything, but I think I am, particularly like even this kind of, murder of my key informant. So I am doing in a way that, whatever in my capacity to try to reciprocate really my informants, because they cooperated with me, but again, that isn't easy. I think you can do it when you are conducting research, but when you are even writing, because writing articles and book, when you do it, it isn't like you are writing book and articles together with the people that you studied, because I interviewed more than 100 people. I can't just ask everybody, okay, can you read? And, if you have any objections or whether you feel comfortable, I mean, if I have only one interviewee, I could do that, but I had more than near 150 people over a decade. So I think really, even though when we try to make this ethnography research process as more democratic between ethnographer and the people we study, but I think when we talk about writing, publishing those things, I still feel it's not really even, So I don't know, what really better ways. I am really still being a bit agonized over this question, So yeah, so I would say that, and this isn't anything that anthropologists also talked about a lot. We talked about a lot when we are conducting research, how to conduct research more, democratic way. But then when we write, unless you co-author with them, but co-authoring with one interviewee is one thing, but how can you co-author it with 150 people, So it's a very difficult question, and I have a challenge. I would say that the people who read my book, how they feel about, So I mean, not only in the early 90s, when I went to South LA, when I tried to talk to African Americans, and some African Americans, they tried to spit on me, you know. Yeah, because, you know, right, they heard the verdict, you know, so they really didn't like it. They had a problem, you know, but what I'm saying here is that I mean, that was expected, how to study, how to conduct research among African Americans when we have still this kind of controversial Black Korean tension, you know. But then, you know, even it wasn't easy to study among Korean Americans, you know, my fellow Korean Americans. That isn't easy either, because if we include what I write, how I write, you know, so I think I will just leave it there, and maybe we're gonna have a more discussion along this line in the future, I would say.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your work. Thanks also to Rocio for your comments. Please join us next week. As I said at the beginning, we'll be discussing the work of Professor Elizabeth Cohen. She's a political scientist at Syracuse. She has a new book out titled Illegal: How America's Lawless Immigration Regime Threatens Us All. We'll have a comment from Professor Maggie Peters, political scientist at UCLA, and we'd very much look forward to seeing you on the call as well. Have a